This week, we are going to talk all about methods. Sometimes people refer to these as functions. They are essentially the same thing with a slight difference. Methods are attached to a class, functions are not. In C Sharp, since everything has to be attached to a class, the way we structure our programs, we will call these methods. So you've been using methods throughout the course already. This week, we're going to work on creating our own. So, for example, let's say you have a program that does something like this. We're going to put out a little greeting. Hello, please tell me your name. And then we will have a string, name equals read line. And then we will write using a format string, hello, name. That will be our program. So we run that and we will print out our output. Tell me your name. We'll wait for the prompt. My name is Bob, and it'll print hello, Bob. So hopefully nothing too surprising there based on code you have already seen throughout the course. Just restructure these windows a little bit. Give us a little room. Now, let's say that we want to call this code multiple times for some reason. We want to be able to request someone's name a bunch of times, or there's something we want to do a bunch of times. We can put this in a loop. We can copy and paste this a whole bunch of times, or we can create a method. So, create a method in C Sharp. The way that we have to do it right now is we use the term static. The return type of the method for right now, I'm going to use void, and we will say greet user is the name of our method. So, static allows our C Sharp method to be called from main, the way that we have our C Sharp program structured so far. That's how we have to do it. Void tells us what this method is going to return to us, in this case, nothing. And then this is the name of the method, and methods always have parentheses next to their name. So now I'm going to move this code into our method. And then if I were to run this, I just want to point this out. If I run this the way it is right now, nothing happens because execution starts in main here at the opening curly brace and ends when we reach the ending curly brace, and nothing is happening here. To execute this code, we will have to call that method by using its name and then parentheses. Now you'll notice methods are colored yellow here in this IDE, and you'll see that we've been using methods. Write line and read line are both built-in methods, but now we've created our own called greet user. Now I'm going to put a breakpoint here so you can see what happens. If I execute this program, we're inside of main. We see this call to greet user, and instead of clicking step over, I'm going to click step into. This tells us to jump into the method, and now we are inside the greet user method. If you look down here at the call stack tab, you can see we are in this method and we got here from this method, line 13. If you double click that, it'll highlight it for you and say, this is how you got to that method. So that call stack will change as we enter and exit different methods. Once we're inside the method, everything proceeds as normal. We execute our code, and then we leave the method and go back to main. So if we were to call that method multiple times, let's do this. Let's put a little break in here just so you can see that that's happening. And we'll call the greet user method again. So you can see that we'll call the greet user method once, and then we will be back in main once that exits so that we can execute this line. And then we will execute greet user once again. So we start here, then we execute all this code, go to the next line, then we go to this line, execute all this code, jump back. Now, a couple of things about methods to be aware of is that every method has its own scope, meaning any variables created within a method can only be used inside that method unless we return the variable as the return value of the method. This method doesn't return anything, that's why it has a return type of void, but let's make a method that does something different. We'll create one that returns a string called getUserName. This method is going to use these two lines. And we're being very simplistic here just to illustrate the point of methods, but your methods can be as complicated as you want. So I want to just show you, let's say that I call get username here. So now I'm not calling this. You can notice here the IDE tells me this has 0 references. Nobody is using this method. So this method has 1 reference. It's being used 1 time. So we call get username. And if I try to do this, just want to show you why this won't work. Notice that this gets highlighted and it says the name does not exist in the current context. So this variable, remember, we created it inside of this method, inside of this scope. So it cannot be used up here. Let me just delete this so it's clear. This method is where name is created. And if we try to use it here, it just doesn't exist. If we want to use it here, since we made this method a string return value, we can say return name. Once we do that, then we can take the return value of this method and store it in a variable. And to do that, we will say string, what we're capturing, where we're storing it, and we set it equal to this method. And what that does is it executes the method. Whatever value gets returned gets stored here in this variable. Okay, so if I run this, what you'll see is now this works as expected. This method executes. Whatever value stored here gets returned and stored into this variable. Now, often we will use the same name for this, but we don't have to. So I just want to point this out so that it's very clear. We are not accessing this variable. We are taking the value in this variable. This method returns it, and it gets stored here. So when we execute a method, the return value essentially gets put in place of where we type the method name. So if I type Steve in that, then it's the same thing as if I had typed this. Okay. The method gets replaced with the return value, and then it's like we wrote this line of code instead. So very important to grasp that concept. So let's step through and we'll see that in action. Our get username method will step into that. Now I'm going to switch to step over so I don't step into the system methods. That can cause headaches. So here's my name, going to be Steve. And now name is Steve. Now again, notice the call stack. I'm inside the get username method. If I jump back to main, I have access to look at the variable values and notice that username is still null. So I'm now going to return, and now I'm right back here. So right now, this method is about to be replaced with its return value. When that happens, now username is set to Steve because that's what we returned from our method. Just to see that more clearly, if I say return Bob and I get rid of all of that code, then what happens here is that username is going to be set to Bob because get username is replaced with whatever we return here. It doesn't matter what the name of the variable is. All that matters is the value. The value gets stored here. This confuses a lot of people. So with our methods, we can return any type. We can return ints, floats, doubles, etc. And we can call that method as many times as we want. Now, the rule of thumb for methods is that generally every method should do exactly one thing. A method should be named as a verb describing what it does. So here, it gets the username. That's the only thing it does. So we could create another method, and again, we have to prefix all of these with static. This method's not going to return anything, and it's just going to be called say hello. Now this method, it's going to use whatever username we get back from the first method. So to do that, we're going to create what's called a parameter or an argument. People use those interchangeably, technically different, but we'll just use parameter. The parameter has to have a type, and then it has to have a name that we can refer to. It's essentially like declaring a variable that's only going to be used within the method. I'm going to give it a different name. I'm going to call it the name. just so we can differentiate it. And then within this method, I'm going to say write line, hello to you, name. So that's what this method's going to do. Now, instead of writing hello up here, I'm going to call the say hello method. And notice when I put the parentheses here, the IDE tells me I need to give it a string that it's going to use for its name. And I'm going to give it the username variable since that's a string. So to recap, at the beginning, we're going to call this method, get username. It's going to do some stuff. It's going to return a string value. That value we're going to store here. Then we're going to call the say hello method, which requires a string value to work. We're going to pass it this string value, username, and then it's going to store that in this parameter, which we've called the name. I changed this so it would have a different name on purpose. We're using different names all the way through because I want to emphasize very strongly that these variables are not connected in any way. A lot of times you'll see all of these named the same thing, but they are three different variables. They just happen to have the same name. So in this case, I've named them differently so you can see that. So let's step through this and see what happens. So here, we're going to step into that first method. We're going to write the line. We'll read the name. Tom. Currently, the name variable only within this method has value of Tom. We're going to return that. And so now the username variable has that value. We're then going to call the say hello method, passing that value. And again, we're not passing the variable, we're passing the value that the variable contains. We'll step into that method. And once we do, we can see the name is now set to Tom because that's what we passed in here. And we write that line. And then we jump back out of that method because we're finished. This method is a void method, so it does not have a return value. All right, so methods can do anything we want. Any code that we've written previously can instead be stored in a method and should be. We've previously been writing a whole bunch of code in main, which we should not do from this point forward. Any code we write should be in a method. Each method should have one job. The method's name should indicate what that job is. So if we are writing, for example, the loan amortization schedule, we should have one method that would get the loan value, another method that would get the interest rate, another method that would get the payment value. We would then have another method that would calculate the amortization schedule. So each of those methods have one job, and we call each of those in main. Main should only be calling methods and sending values from one method to the other. That's the only thing the main method should be doing. So just to wrap up, I want to strongly emphasize that you get used to the terminology that I've been using in this video, because when you ask questions or search for answers on Google or on Stack Overflow or in the textbook, using the proper terminology will make sure that you find the answers you're looking for. Get username and say hello. Those are the names of methods. We call a method in main. So we are calling or executing the get username method. The get username method returns a string. That string gets stored in this variable. We are storing the return value. We are not storing the variable. When we call the say hello method, we pass the username to it by using this variable. We are not passing the variable itself, we are passing the value stored in this variable. That gets stored in this parameter, which we then use within the body of the method. Any variable declared in the body of a method can only be used within that scope. The scope is always defined as the section between the two curly braces where the variable was declared. This is the declaration. Okay, that's the same that we saw with if statements and while loops and switches, etc., etc. Okay, right. So that's all I'm going to talk about with methods. If you have questions as you go through to do your assignments, make sure you ask on Slack or through email. Methods are the first, what we call abstraction in programming. It's the first time that things start to get a little confusing. So make sure that if things aren't making sense, don't think, well, I'm sure it'll make more sense later. It will not make more sense later. Make sure that you ask questions. Otherwise, you will just continue to be a little bit confused, and that confusion will compound as we learn more complicated things. So go through the reading, look at the exercises there. And if you have questions, again, please make sure to ask.